Hey everyone. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that was at once filthy, fragrant, fearful, and strangely beautiful, the world of medieval hygiene. From the drafty garderobes of stone castles to the perfumed courts of France, from the unwashed crowds of London to the dazzling bathhouses of the Arab world, this is the story of how people lived, coped, and found meaning in a world that viewed cleanliness very differently from our own. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the journeys we take here. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love seeing this little circle of history lovers gathering from across the globe. Now dim the lights. Let the noise of the day slip away. Close your eyes, and let's wander together through the sights, sounds, and scents of a medieval street, where every smell tells a story. Close your eyes for a moment, and step with me into a medieval banquet hall. The air is heavy, and not in a poetic way. It's the weight of roasting meats, sour ale, unwashed bodies, and something faintly, latrine-like. Candles sputter against the stone walls, their smoke clinging to the already stale atmosphere. Somewhere beneath the long wooden tables, dogs gnaw at discarded bones, snapping at each other over scraps that only hours ago were considered a nobleman's dinner. A minstrel is playing, but you can barely hear him over the clatter of trenchers, the drunken laughter of men who haven't bathed in months, and the sharp sound of chamber pots being emptied out the nearest window. You shift in your seat, or maybe it's not your seat at all, because in a hall like this, the lines between dining chair and splintered plank are mostly conceptual. You glance toward the nobles at the high table. They look glamorous in their jewel-toned robes, until you notice the perfume, heavy enough to choke you, an olfactory armor against the fact that none of them have been near a bath since Easter. And when nature calls, you don't leave for a restroom. There isn't one. You find a corner, or a pot, or a dark stairwell, and hope no one important notices. This is the world of medieval hygiene, or rather, its remarkable absence. A world where bathing too often was seen as risky, where perfume covered more sins than confession, where the streets flowed with waste, and even the most elegant castles had garderobes that doubled as vulnerable entry points for invaders. Welcome to the filthy truth of medieval Europe. Imagine it's a damp spring morning in a bustling medieval town. The narrow streets are slick with yesterday's rain, and with other things you'd rather not name, and the smell alone could knock you off your feet. Bread baking, rotting vegetables, manure, smoke, sweat, and the sour tang of a chamber pot emptied too close to your doorstep all mixed in the air. You pass a group of laborers heading to work, their faces and hands streaked with grime, their clothes stiff with months of accumulated dirt. No one looks embarrassed. No one apologizes. This isn't neglect. This is life. For most people in medieval Europe, a full-body bath wasn't part of the weekly routine. It wasn't even part of the monthly one. In many towns and villages, ordinary people washed only when absolutely necessary, on religious holidays, before a wedding, or perhaps in preparation for death. And when they did wash, it wasn't the luxurious soak you might imagine. Picture instead a wooden tub filled with lukewarm water, likely shared by several family members, the youngest going in first and the rest taking their turn in what was left. Soap, if it existed at all, was harsh, expensive, and used sparingly. This wasn't simple laziness. It was fear. Medieval medicine, built on the ancient theory of humors, taught that bathing, especially in hot water, opened the pores. Through those open pores, people believed, corrupt air could slip in and unbalance your body's delicate humors, inviting disease. Water itself was suspect, especially stagnant or communal water. Physicians warned against bathing after eating, after work, or in winter. The idea of a refreshing daily wash? That was the kind of thing you'd expect to read in a fable about paradise, not in a serious medical text. And then there was the matter of morality. In cities where public bathhouses survived from Roman times, they had gained an unsavory reputation. Steam and bare skin made for easy gossip, and gossip easily turned to scandal. Monastic writers warned that the bathhouse was a place where immodesty and sin flourished. Local preachers thundered against idle bathing, done for pleasure rather than health. Some towns even shuttered their bathhouses entirely, seeing them as hotbeds of vice. So, layer by layer, Europe built a cultural case for filth. Dirt became a kind of armor, not only against the chill of unheated homes and drafty castles, but against invisible spiritual and physical threats. If you never stripped away that protective crust, then nothing bad could sneak in. And yet, medieval Europeans weren't entirely cut off from the idea of regular washing. They had heard stories of other lands, of people who treated bathing as a daily necessity instead of a rare indulgence. Crusaders who traveled to the Middle East returned with astonished tales of the great hammams of Damascus, Cairo, and Jerusalem, domed sanctuaries of steam, tiled in bright colors, where washing was an act of both hygiene and piety. In the glittering Byzantine capital of Constantinople, travelers described vast public baths where rich and poor mingled in the heat, attended by servants with perfumed oils and clean towels. And yet, even when they admired these places, they didn't bring those habits home. Not fully. In a Europe scarred by plague and governed by strict moral codes, the very idea of immersing yourself in water too often seemed decadent, even dangerous. It was safer to stay dry, to cover the body in layers of fabric, to mask the odors with pungent herbs or perfumes than to risk what a good long wash might invite. So day by day, season by season, life went on like this. The smell of unwashed bodies dulled by sweet-smelling sachets tucked into sleeves, dirt worked so deeply into skin that it seemed permanent, and a lingering belief that too much cleanliness might just be the death of you. If you asked a medieval European why they didn't bathe more often, the answer wouldn't have been a simple shrug. They had reasons, complicated, layered reasons, that made perfect sense in their world. To start with, water itself wasn't trusted. In an age when clean, running water was rare and most streams doubled as open sewers, immersing your body in it felt less like a cleansing ritual and more like rolling the dice with your health. Stagnant ponds were breeding grounds for disease, wells could be fouled by waste, and rivers carried the runoff of entire towns. Chroniclers wrote grimly of corrupted waters, spreading sickness, reinforcing the idea that water wasn't purifying but tainted, especially when heated and reused in communal baths. Even physicians, who might have been expected to advocate for cleanliness, saw danger in the bathhouse. The 12th century medical writer Aldobrandino of Siena, in his Regimen Sanitatis, warned that hot baths weakened the body and let illness slip in through the open skin. To him, that comforting warmth didn't soothe, it made you soft, your defenses lowered against the unseen poisons of the world. In winter, he advised, stay dry. In times of plague, he said, avoid baths entirely. This wasn't fringe thinking. It was mainstream medical advice. And morality was never far from the conversation. Public bathhouses, once proud remnants of Roman infrastructure, had become cultural battlegrounds. To a pious monk or a sharp-tongued preacher, they were places where the boundaries of decency blurred as easily as the steam on their stone walls. Theologians worried that mixed bathing, or even the pleasure of soaking in warm water, led to immodest thoughts, and worse. In 15th century Paris, preachers went so far as to condemn the city's bathhouses as chapels of the devil. Municipal authorities closed many of them during outbreaks of plague, citing not only hygiene fears but their association with vice. So if you wanted to be virtuous, if you wanted to be safe, you stayed away. Cleanliness became tied to suspicion, a sign of vanity, perhaps even of moral corruption. In some places, bathing for pleasure was outright forbidden during periods of fasting or penitence. Monks in certain orders were allowed full baths only a few times a year, usually on Easter or Christmas, and even then with reluctance. The filth on their skin was interpreted as spiritual armor, a visible sign of humility and discipline. Yet even with all these taboos, the idea of bathing didn't vanish. It just went elsewhere. When European Crusaders arrived in the Levant during the 11th and 12th centuries, they encountered something radically different, the hammam, the Islamic bathhouse. In places like Damascus, Acre, and Jerusalem, bathing wasn't suspect. It was routine. It was tied to religious purification, to community, to health. Crusaders wrote home about these exotic establishments where men and women bathed frequently, often in elaborate, tiled chambers perfumed with oils and incense. Some Crusaders adopted the habit themselves, though not without grumbling. The Knight Fulcher of Chartres, chronicling his time in the Holy Land, noted with mild astonishment that Franks now bathed like the locals, scrubbing themselves in public baths at least once a week, an unimaginable luxury back in their cold stone castles. Returning to Europe, these soldiers and pilgrims carried with them stories of the hammams, sparking a quiet revival of bathing in certain cosmopolitan pockets, especially in southern France and Italy. But the wider culture resisted. The fears remained: disease in the water, sin in the steam, vanity in the mirror. And so the medieval compromise took shape: a quick wash of the hands and face, a scented sachet sewn into one's clothes, perhaps a splash of rosewater on the hair. Enough to feel respectable, not enough to risk illness or impropriety. To us, it feels like superstition. To them, it felt like survival. If Europe had largely turned away from bathing, it didn't mean people were content to simply live with the stench. They found another solution: not to scrub the body clean, but to cover it. Perfume, herbs, and scented waters became the invisible cloak of medieval respectability. For the wealthy, this was more than personal hygiene, it was status. In courts from Paris to Naples, nobles dabbed themselves with rosewater, orange blossom, or lavender distillations. They wore pomander, small, ornate balls filled with cloves, myrrh, or crushed rosemary, suspended from belts or rosary chains, allowing them to carry a portable shield of fragrance wherever they went. These weren't just pleasant smells. They were thought to guard against illness. The logic was simple: if disease traveled through foul air, then sweet, pungent aromas could repel it. The physician Guy de Chauliac, writing in his Chirurgia Magna in the mid-148th century, advised his readers during plague time to carry strong-smelling herbs such as rue, wormwood, and sage, and to wash their hands with scented vinegar to ward off corruption. It wasn't bathing, but it was cleansing in its own way, a ritual of aromatic defense against the unseen enemy in the air. But perfumes weren't only for medicine. They were armor for the senses in a world where unwashed bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder in church, at market, or in the great halls of lords. In the crowded feasting halls of castles, the mingling of roasting meat, spilled ale, wet dogs, and 100 unwashed bodies could be overwhelming. "It is better to hold sweet herbs to the nose," wrote one anonymous 13th century household guide, "than to endure the smell of the commons." Crusaders returning from the Holy Land had stories to tell about the Eastern love of fragrance. Fulcher of Chartres, one of those wide-eyed pilgrims, remarked on the delightful baths of the Levant, where not only washing but anointing with oils was part of the ritual. To a soldier accustomed to the austere washcloth of a European monastery, or the freezing tub of a draughty hall, the scented oils of Damascus must have seemed a revelation. They brought some of these practices home, not the daily bathing, but the perfumes, the oils, the sense that sweet smells could transform the body without the need for water. And so a new kind of cleanliness emerged, cleanliness by proxy. Noblewomen bathed their hair in rosewater while their skin went untouched for weeks. Cloaks were perfumed, gloves lined with herbs, and bed linens sprinkled with violet or chamomile to keep the stench of sweat at bay. In one 15th century account, a Burgundian courtier noted that his lady smelled always of roses and of musk, though he did not mention when she last touched water. For the poor, perfumes were beyond reach, but they too found ways to mask reality. They stitched sachets of cheap herbs, sage, marjoram, mint, into their clothing or rubbed crushed juniper into their hands to dull the smell of toil. In the great Gothic cathedrals, priests swung censers filled with incense, creating holy clouds of frankincense and myrrh, not only to honor God but to overpower the earthy smell of hundreds of bodies packed into the nave. It's easy to scoff at this fragrant masquerade. But to medieval people, these perfumes weren't deception. They were protection, against disease, against social shame, against the judgment of neighbors and, perhaps, of heaven itself. Yet, despite the rosewater and pomanders, the filth remained. It seeped into the walls of their homes, clung to their clothes, and lingered on their skin. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the places where waste collected, not far from where they ate, prayed, and slept. Perfume in medieval Europe wasn't just about masking filth, it was a declaration. A person's scent announced who they were long before they spoke. In noble courts, the rich smell of musk or ambergris could signal wealth as clearly as a jewel-studded belt. These rare ingredients came from far-off lands, musk from Tibet, ambergris from the guts of sperm whales washed ashore, and their cost made them luxuries only the elite could afford. To smell of them was to declare yourself above the stench of the streets. But perfumes weren't only worn on the skin. They were sewn into the very fabric of daily life. Clothing could be lined with scented sachets, shoes rubbed with herbs, even the air itself treated with fragrance. In the courts of Burgundy and France, servants scattered dried lavender and marjoram across the rush-covered floors, so each step released a faint, pleasant aroma. Royal banquets saw tables decorated with sprigs of rosemary and basil, their scent mingling with the roasted meats and spiced wine. This scented world was as much medicine as vanity. Medieval people believed that bad smells carried sickness, the dreaded miasma. A foul odor didn't just make you wrinkle your nose, it made you vulnerable. Sweetness, on the other hand, was protection. Evil air enters by the nose, wrote a Parisian physician during the Black Death. And it is driven away by the strength of perfumes. In times of plague, doctors stuffed the beaked masks of their long cloaks with herbs and spices, creating portable fortresses of smell. Pomanders, little hollow balls filled with crushed cloves, cinnamon, or camphor, became everyday talismans, swung beneath one's chin in the hope that a perfumed cloud could ward off death itself. And then there was the influence of the East. Crusaders and merchants returning from Constantinople or the Levant didn't just bring back tales of tiled bathhouses. They brought exotic scents. Frankincense from Arabia, myrrh from the Red Sea, citrus oils from the groves of Al-Andalus. These new fragrances infiltrated European courts, transforming them into olfactory theaters. Fulcher of Chartres had marveled at the oils and scents most pleasing, used in Syrian bathhouses, where the very act of washing was wrapped in fragrance. Europe, ever hesitant to adopt foreign bathing rituals, happily embraced the perfumes. Even monasteries, where water was used sparingly, couldn't resist the power of scent. The Benedictine rule prescribed moderation, but monastic apothecaries quietly cultivated fragrant herbs for balms, ointments, and incense. In cloistered gardens, rosemary, sage, and lavender grew in neat rows, their perfumes sanctified by purpose. Scent, in this context, wasn't indulgence, it was devotion. Yet for all their rosewater rinses and clove-stuffed pomanders, medieval people lived in a paradox. They smelled of violets and of sweat, of incense and of refuse. The perfume didn't erase the filth. It only dressed it up. And in the end, those sweet scents had their limits. Because no matter how hard you tried to mask it, the waste of an entire city, or even a single household, had a way of making its presence known. If perfumes were the polite mask of medieval life, the reality of waste told the unfiltered truth. Because for all the rosewater and sweet-smelling sachets, the medieval world still had to answer a simple question: where does it all go? In towns and villages, the answer was usually, wherever it could. Human waste was collected in chamber pots, simple wooden, ceramic, or metal bowls, and emptied into the street or into open ditches running alongside homes. A polite householder might shout a warning, "Garde-la," from the French gardes l'eau. Watch out for the water, before tossing the contents of their pot out the window. But if you didn't move fast enough, you risked a medieval baptism of sorts. Streets weren't paved and sewer systems were rudimentary at best, so all this refuse mixed with rain, animal droppings, and whatever else people discarded. Travelers complained of wading ankle-deep through liquid filth, while chroniclers wrote of cities where the stench clung to every alley. Even London, growing into one of Europe's great capitals, was mocked in the 14th century for its detestable smell, when warm weather baked its refuse into a reeking stew. But surely the castles of lords and kings were better? In some ways, yes, but not by much. In great fortresses like Windsor or the Louvre, long before it became a museum, toilets were built into the walls, small stone chambers called garderobes. A garderobe was essentially a wooden seat set over a vertical shaft. Whatever you left there dropped directly down into a pit, a cesspool, or, if your castle had a moat, into the water below. These were marvels of convenience, until you remembered that no one was cleaning those moats. Chroniclers tell of moats so choked with waste they became cesspools of disease, breeding grounds for dysentery and worse. In winter the shafts froze, in summer they festered. The smell drifted up through the seats, which doubled as ventilation pipes for an entire castle's digestive history. And even in castles, danger lurked in these places. A garderobe might seem an unlikely battlefield, but attackers sometimes used the waste chutes as entry points during sieges. There are stories, equal parts horrifying and absurd, of soldiers climbing up through latrine shafts to infiltrate castles. Imagine defending your lord's honor only to find an enemy soldier emerging from the privy. In larger towns, civic authorities eventually tried to impose order. London, Paris, and Bruges passed ordinances requiring residents to clean the ditches outside their homes or face fines. But these laws were rarely enforced. The streets remained what they had been for centuries, shared spaces for walking, working, and relieving oneself when necessary. Inside homes, even noble ones, the chamber pot reigned supreme. Servants carried them away in the morning, dumping their contents into rivers, streams, or designated dung heaps outside city walls. Some wealthier households had gong farmers, men hired to clean out cesspits when they became too full to ignore. It was foul, dangerous work, but someone had to do it. And so, beneath the pomp of feasts and the politeness of perfumes, the medieval world carried on in a haze of waste. In villages and castles alike, hygiene was less about eliminating filth than learning to live with it. If you wanted to know what medieval towns smelled like, you didn't need to live in one. You could just read the complaints of those who passed through. Travelers left no shortage of gripes. The Florentine merchant Francesco di Balducci Pegolotti, writing in the 14th century, described London's streets as foul and full of refuse, making walking perilous. A century earlier, the Arab diplomat Ibn Jubair had marveled at the wealth of Christian cities in Europe but couldn't help noting that their markets reeked with filth, and their streets were not fit for men of cleanly habits. These weren't idle insults. They were the observations of people whose own cultures prized clean public spaces and were shocked by the squalor of European towns. And city authorities knew the problem. We can still read the ordinances of places like London and Paris, where officials tried, and often failed, to wrestle with the stench. In 1357, the City of London ordered householders to stop dumping waste into the open ditches that lined Cheapside and other main thoroughfares, threatening fines for those who turned streets into sewers. Parisian regulations from the same period forbade tanners from letting their chemical-laden wastewater flow through public lanes. But enforcing these laws was another matter. As one London clerk complained in the city's records, "Many do cast filth into the highways, heedless of the penalty." The stench wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a public hazard. People believed, correctly in some cases, that foul air bred disease. When the Black Death swept through Europe, many cities cracked down on what they saw as the sources of corruption. But even in plague time, the solutions were temporary. Ditches were cleaned, cesspits emptied, and then, when the crisis passed, the cycle of neglect began anew. And the garderobes, those small, drafty castle latrines, carried their own miseries. They were supposed to be convenient, but more than one unfortunate soul met their end in them. There's a grim story from 1183 about Wenceslaus III of Bohemia, who was murdered while using a garderobe, assassins reportedly climbing up through the shaft to strike him down. And if enemies weren't crawling up through the chute, there was still the very real danger of falling in. In 1326, a London coroner's roll records the death of a man who drowned in a cesspit after the wooden floor of an outhouse gave way beneath him. It's one of many such accidents buried in medieval court documents, reminders that even relieving yourself carried mortal risk. In some cases, the filth was weaponized. Siege warfare manuals occasionally advised poisoning or contaminating water supplies, which often meant targeting the same ditches and moats that doubled as waste collectors. More than once, A besieging army gained an advantage simply by turning a castle's moat into a fetid swamp of disease. For ordinary people, though, these weren't strategic concerns. They were everyday facts of life. You stepped carefully through streets that doubled as sewers. You lived with the smell of a privy that vented straight into the room below. You tried not to think too hard about what floated in the moat under your window. And yet, despite the filth, cities grew. Markets thrived. Feasts were held. Life went on. The medieval world simply learned to breathe through its nose, or perhaps to ignore the smell altogether. Behind the spectacle of bustling marketplaces and the solemnity of great cathedrals, an entire underclass worked in the shadows, wrestling with the consequences of all that filth. These were the gong farmers, the men hired to clean out the cesspits, latrines, and ditches when they became too full to ignore. The term, gong, comes from the Old English word for going, as in, the place you go. Gong farmers were, quite literally, the cleaners of what had been gone. It was dangerous, degrading work, but someone had to do it. They usually worked at night, under cover of darkness, when the smell wouldn't travel as far and the sight of their work wouldn't offend the more delicate sensibilities of city folk. Armed with long-handled shovels, buckets, and sheer stubbornness, they descended into cesspits to remove months or even years of accumulated human waste. Imagine climbing down a narrow stone shaft, the air thick and choking, knowing one misstep could mean drowning in the very thing you were meant to clear. And the pay? It was surprisingly good, at least compared to other lowly trades. In London, records from the 14th century show gong farmers earning more than common laborers, a recognition of the risk they faced. But the job also came with heavy restrictions. Gong farmers often lived on the outskirts of towns, away from respectable neighborhoods. They weren't allowed to work during daylight hours. In some cities, they were required to wear distinctive clothing so people could identify them and keep their distance. Even with the pits emptied, the smell lingered. People developed all sorts of coping mechanisms. In homes, rushes or straw scattered across the floor were sprinkled with herbs like lavender, thyme, or marjoram, giving at least the illusion of freshness as they were crushed underfoot. In churches, incense served a dual purpose, sanctifying the space and masking the odor of hundreds of unwashed bodies in close quarters. The wealthy had their own tricks. In castles, garderobes were sometimes built as far from living quarters as possible, tucked into outer walls or projecting over moats. Some were fitted with small shafts or windows to provide airflow, primitive ventilation that helped keep the worst of the smell at bay. Nobles often carried pomanders, little metal spheres filled with cloves or musk, which they could raise to their noses whenever the surrounding stench became unbearable. But for ordinary townsfolk, coping was simply a matter of endurance. You held your breath. You became nose-blind. You walked quickly past the ditches and prayed the wind was in your favor. Chroniclers occasionally described summer heat waves with particular dread, when the stench of the streets and cesspits became almost unbearable, clinging to everything like a second skin. And yet life carried on. The gong farmers would shovel out the pits, the ditches would be cleared, for a time, and the city would breathe a little easier. Until, inevitably, it all filled up again. In this way, medieval hygiene wasn't about eliminating filth. It was about managing it, just enough to keep life going in the shadow of the stench. In the grand halls of Europe's castles, the smell of spiced wine and roasting meats might have greeted your nose. But follow the draft to a side passage or a narrow stairwell, and you'd find the other reality of courtly life, the garderobe. Despite their unassuming appearance, often just a wooden seat set into a stone alcove, garderobes were feats of medieval engineering. They had to be. A castle was a living fortress, home to dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, all producing waste that had to go somewhere. These privies were usually tucked into the thickness of the outer walls, their shafts dropping straight down into cesspits, or, if the lord was lucky, into a flowing moat that carried everything away. Some castles took pride in their garderobes, incorporating them into their defenses. The Louvre, long before it became a museum, was a fortress with an impressive array of latrines. Its garderobes jutted out over the moat in little protruding stone chambers, nicknamed murderers' balconies, by some later historians for their tactical potential. From below, these chutes were both a source of contamination and, alarmingly, a possible route for intruders. Siege accounts occasionally describe attackers climbing up through privy shafts, a grotesque but effective way to bypass locked gates. Other castles got creative with their layouts. At Bodiam Castle in England, garderobes were built in clusters, allowing multiple people to relieve themselves in relative privacy while sharing a single chute. In Conisbrough Castle, some privies had small ventilation slits, an early attempt at freshening the air in a room where one bad draft could ruin your appetite for days. Yet for all this ingenuity, life with a garderobe wasn't pleasant. They were cold in winter, sweltering in summer, and always haunted by the smell rising from below. In some places, dried herbs were scattered across the seats or stuffed into cracks to mask the stench, but it was a losing battle. Servants had the unenviable job of scraping out the cesspits when they filled, a task as dangerous as it was repulsive. And the garderobe's proximity to living quarters could be its own hazard. In a 15th century letter, one English noblewoman complained that the smell from her lord's privy did poison the air of his chamber. Some lords kept fur-trimmed cloaks hanging in garderobes, not for convenience, but because the ammonia from the waste was thought to repel moths. It also infused the clothes with an unforgettable aroma, which might explain why they were rarely worn outside the castle. Despite all of this, the garderobe was a mark of status. To have a private seat, shielded from the public eye, was a luxury denied to most of medieval society. In towns, people still relied on chamber pots or shared latrines, dumping their contents wherever space allowed. But inside these stone fortresses, lords and ladies could retreat to their own little alcoves, drafty, smelly, but undeniably theirs. Of course, no amount of stonework could fully keep the waste at bay. It seeped into the ground, floated in the moats, and clung to the very walls. In some castles, archaeologists have found garderobe chutes so encrusted with centuries of refuse that they'd become time capsules of medieval diet and disease. A grim reminder that even in the highest towers, filth was never far away. If castles were fortresses of practical filth, monasteries were islands of intentional austerity. And yet, even there, sanitation walked a strange line between ritual purity and grim necessity. Monks lived by strict rules, often set out in the Rule of Saint Benedict or later adaptations, which dictated when and how they could wash. And while monasteries may conjure images of scrubbed floors and gleaming cloisters, cleanliness wasn't pursued for comfort. It was pursued for discipline, for humility, and above all, for God. Bathing was rare. Some orders permitted only a handful of full baths per year, on Easter, Christmas, and perhaps a saint's feast day. The rest of the time, monks relied on partial washing, dipping their hands and faces in basins of cold water. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the fiery 12th century reformer, scolded those who indulged in what he saw as luxurious hygiene. To wash the body too often, he wrote, is to cleanse it beyond what is meet for humility. To scrub away all dirt was, in some eyes, to scrub away the outward sign of holy suffering. And yet monasteries were far from negligent. They were some of the best organized communities of the age, and their approach to waste and water was often far more advanced than that of the bustling towns outside their walls. Many monasteries built lavatoria, long stone troughs with running water, where monks washed their hands before meals and prayers. Cistercian abbeys, in particular, became famous for their hydraulic ingenuity, diverting streams to provide fresh water for kitchens, breweries, and even rudimentary flushing systems for their latrines. Those latrines, often called necessaria, were far from the single-seat garderobes of castles. In great abbeys like Cluny or Rievaulx, they were vast communal chambers, with rows of stone or wooden seats overflowing water channels. The design was deliberate, efficient, easy to clean, and kept separate from the sleeping quarters to minimize both temptation and smell. The Benedictine order required that these latrines be used in silence, turning even the most basic bodily functions into an act of collective contemplation. But even here, sanitation had its limits. Cesspits still filled, drains still clogged, and foul air lingered. Chroniclers note that outbreaks of dysentery, the monastic flux, as some rightly called it, swept through cloisters just as they did through towns. Even in these carefully managed spaces, the fragility of hygiene was always apparent. Monastic cleanliness wasn't about comfort. It was about order, the kind of order that mirrored the divine. The daily rhythm of washing hands before prayer, the quiet ritual of cleaning one's feet on Maundy Thursday, the tending of herb gardens where mint and rosemary masked the cloister's less holy smells, all of it turned sanitation into devotion. And so, while castles battled their garderobes stench with desperation and towns coped with their cesspits through brute endurance, monasteries spiritualized their filth, wrapping it in prayer and structure. Dirt, after all, was a reminder of the flesh. And in the monastic mind, the flesh was never meant to be too comfortable. Step through the heavy doors of a medieval great hall at mealtime, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell. Roasting meats drip fat onto open flames, spiced pies steam on wooden platters, and pitchers of ale slosh as they're carried across rush-strewn floors. But beneath the feast day aromas lies the sour undertone of unwashed bodies, wet dogs, and the faint, ever-present tang of chamber pots tucked discreetly, or not so discreetly, in corners. The tables are long, heavy trestles lined with benches. If you're of noble birth, you sit at the high table, slightly elevated and served first. If not, you squeeze in with the rest, shoulder to shoulder, where elbows are weapons and space is a privilege. Dogs weave underfoot, not the dainty lapdogs of noble portraits but rangy hounds and mutts, licking grease from the floor and snapping up discarded bones. Your plate isn't really a plate, it's a trencher, a thick slab of stale bread hollowed slightly to hold your food. When you're done, you don't scrape it clean. You toss it to the dogs or hand it to a servant to give to the poor. Napkins are rare luxuries. If you need to wipe your hands or face, you use the tablecloth, your sleeve, or, if you're truly lucky, a communal cloth that's been passed along the benches all meal long. And forget about forks. Those delicate instruments existed in Byzantium and the Islamic world, but in much of medieval Europe, eating was a hands-on affair. You tear meat with your fingers, dip bread into communal bowls of stew, and share sauces with your neighbors. There's no such thing as double dipping. Everything is double dipping. Drinking is equally communal. A single large cup may be passed down the table, each person taking a swig of ale or watered wine before handing it to the next. A polite diner might wipe the rim on their tunic. Most don't bother. The 14th century courtesy book, the Babe's Book, gently advised young diners, "Wipe thy spoon and thy cup ere thou take it, for the love of him that shall drink after thee." Wise words, but rarely followed. The floor? It's less a floor than a compost heap in progress. Bones, shells, eggshells, and scraps are tossed under the table as you eat, mingling with the rushes that cover the flagstones. These rushes are changed only a few times a year, becoming layered with months of spilled drink, crumbs, and whatever the dogs leave behind. An Italian visitor to England in the 15th century sniffed that the floors are strewn with rushes which are rarely changed, so that the collection beneath may be more fitting for pigs than for men. Yet for all this, the great hall is a theater of hospitality. Harpists strum as dishes arrive. Minstrels wander between tables, singing ballads over the noise of clattering trenchers. The lord at the high table gestures grandly as he dips his fingers in a perfumed basin between courses. A rare gesture of cleanliness in a setting where hygiene otherwise takes a back seat to indulgence. For the guests below, you make do. You ignore the dog fighting for scraps under your feet. You drink quickly before the next person grabs the cup. You learn to eat with one hand and keep the other clean enough to wipe your face. It's raucous, it's filthy, and it's alive. A world where mealtime is as much survival as celebration. If the medieval banquet hall seems like a free-for-all, it wasn't. Beneath the clatter and the shouting, there were rules, lots of them. Courtesy books, copied by hand and passed among the nobility, laid out exactly how a well-bred person should behave at table. Some rules sound familiar: don't talk with your mouth full, don't reach across your neighbor's plate. But others remind you just how foreign this world was. Take, for example, the Tractatus de Modo et Arte Bene Vivendi, a late medieval guide to good living, which calmly instructs diners. Do not blow your nose on the tablecloth, nor wipe your teeth with it, for it is unseemly. Which tells us two things: people were doing it, and someone had to tell them to stop. The Babe's book, written in the 15th century to teach young pages proper manners, offered more gems. Pick not thy teeth with thy knife at the table. Wipe not thy hands on thy clothes, but use the towel. And perhaps the most earnest advice of all: scratch not thyself where others may see. A simple reminder in a hall full of people whose fleas and lice were as much a part of dinner as the roast venison. Even drinking had rules. A common cup might be shared down the table, but you were expected to take it with one hand only, a show of restraint, and drink modestly. To grip it with two hands like a desperate tavern-goer was a mark of low breeding. And heaven help you if you drained the cup before passing it on. The high table had its own rituals. Lords and ladies often washed their hands before and after the meal in basins of scented water, a small oasis of civility in an otherwise sticky, greasy affair. Carvers performed their duties with theatrical precision, slicing meat into delicate portions while reciting the proper blessings. Food at the high table arrived already cut into neat morsels, sparing its diners the unseemly task of tearing at bones with their teeth, a privilege the lower tables couldn't count on. But even with these rules, the atmosphere was anything but genteel by modern standards. Dogs fought for scraps underfoot. Servants darted between benches with fresh trenchers. Loud conversation and even louder belching filled the air. One late medieval commentator advised guests not to spit across the table, which, like the tablecloth advice, suggests it was a recurring issue. And yet these manners mattered. They were markers of class, of belonging. A clumsy page who licked his knife too obviously or wiped his greasy hands on his tunic could be ridiculed into oblivion. In a society where appearance and reputation were everything, knowing how to eat like a gentleman, even in a hall that smelled like wet dog and old beer, could make or break you. Still, for all the sweet-smelling basins and prim little rules, the banquet hall remained what it had always been, a place where humanity, in all its hunger and messiness, came together to eat, drink, and endure the filth together. If the great hall was a theater of noise and spectacle, the kitchen was its engine, a cavernous, smoky world where the true alchemy of medieval dining took place. Step through the archway, and you're hit by a wall of heat and smell. There's the sharp tang of wood smoke, the savory reek of roasting meat, the sourness of spilled ale, and, if you're unlucky, the faint odor of things well past their prime being repurposed into stews. Meat wasn't refrigerated. It was salted, smoked, or simply cooked before it had the chance to turn truly dangerous. Spices weren't just for flavor. They were the medieval answer to masking decay. And this kitchen is busy. Servants scurry barefoot across the flagstones, carrying baskets of onions, cabbages, and leeks, the vegetables of choice for most dishes. But meat dominates. Whole deer hung on hooks, boar carcasses waiting to be dressed, chickens plucked and gutted with quick, practiced hands. There's no stainless steel counter, no sanitary gloves, no hand-washing station. A kitchen boy might wipe his greasy fingers on his tunic before grabbing the next joint of meat. Pots the size of bathtubs bubble over open hearths, tended by sweating cooks who stir with paddles longer than their arms. Bread bakes in great stone ovens, the loaves shoved in and out with long wooden peels, often with soot and ash clinging to their crusts. And in one corner, a boy grinds spices, cloves, pepper, cinnamon, with a pestle, not for some fancy garnish but to make a questionable cut of mutton taste less like it's been hanging for 3 days in summer heat. Hygiene? It's practical, not scrupulous. Water for washing hands or cleaning implements is fetched from nearby wells or streams, but it's rarely changed. Knives are wiped on rags, and rags aren't often washed. Meat might be butchered on the same wooden block used to chop onions or crush garlic, then left until the next carcass arrives. It's not so much cross-contamination as an expected part of the job. And yet, the kitchen has its own rhythm, its own rules. A chief cook, often a trusted senior servant, oversees everything, ensuring that the Lord's table receives the best cuts and the choicest dishes. Apprentices know their place: peel, chop, fetch, and stay out of the cook's way. The smoke stings your eyes, the air is thick with steam and grease, but this is the beating heart of the feast. Of course, it wasn't all grandeur. While the lord enjoyed roasted swan or spiced venison, the servant's pot, the perpetual stew simmering on a backfire, was a more humble affair: cabbage, barley, a few scraps of meat if they were lucky. And if something fell to the floor? Well, as one medieval proverb put it, what drops on the floor belongs to God, but can still feed a hungry man. Kitchens weren't just functional, they were symbolic. The abundance of food prepared here, despite the grime, despite the shortcuts, was a statement of wealth and power. A lord could tolerate a bit of soot on his bread if it meant a table groaning under the weight of dishes that dazzled his guests. And so, in this world of smoke, sweat, and salted meat, hygiene was relative. Clean enough to keep the feast going. Never so clean that it slowed the work. If the kitchens were a study in practical filth, the medical world of medieval Europe took things to another level. Imagine lying on a straw mattress in a dim, drafty room. Your physician, if you're wealthy enough to afford one, leans over you. He smells faintly of wine, incense, and whatever he last ate. He hasn't washed his hands. He doesn't need to. To a medieval doctor, hand washing before examining a patient wasn't just unnecessary, it could be harmful. The dirt on your skin, like the dirt on his, was seen as part of the body's natural defenses. Medicine at the time rested on the ancient but enduring theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health, physicians believed, depended on keeping these humors in balance. Disease wasn't caused by invisible germs but by an internal or cosmic imbalance, or by bad air, the dreaded miasma. Which meant that washing, especially hot baths, could actually make you worse. As one 14th century physician, Henri de Mondeville, warned, bathing opens the pores and renders the body soft and weak, and more liable to corruption. So instead of prescribing soap and water, a doctor might recommend bloodletting, purging, or a carefully prepared potion of wine and ground herbs. Or perhaps a simple change in your diet: more cold foods if your hot humors were inflamed, more dry foods if your body was too moist. And then there were the remedies that make us blink today. Ear infections? One guide suggested dripping warmed onion juice into the ear. Toothache? Rub the gums with ashes from a burned dog's head. Need to thread a needle? A tailor's manual from the period coolly advised softening the thread with your own earwax. Medieval medicine blurred the line between science, folklore, and sheer improvisation. Hospitals, often run by monastic orders, weren't the gleaming centers of healing we imagine. They were refuges for the sick and dying, places to receive the sacraments and a clean bed, if not much actual treatment. Monks tending to patients rarely washed their hands between the sickbeds, but they prayed, administered simple herbal remedies, and offered care of the soul when the body had little hope. There was a spiritual logic to this, too. Sickness was often interpreted as a test from God, or as punishment for sin. Healing the soul mattered more than healing the flesh. Cleanliness, in that context, was a state of grace, not of skin. And yet there were glimmers of progress. Surgeons like Guy de Chauliac, though far from modern standards, began insisting on cleaner tools and fresher dressings for wounds. Apothecaries experimented with distilling alcohol and herbs into antiseptic tinctures. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. For most medieval people, medical hygiene meant keeping the balance of your humors, perfuming the air to ward off bad miasma, and maybe wearing a saint's relic for extra protection. Soap and clean water? Those were for special occasions. If medieval medical logic sounds strange, the remedies could be downright surreal. Take the plague doctor, for instance. By the 14th century, when the Black Death stalked Europe, physicians began donning what became one of history's most iconic costumes: the long black coat, the wide-brimmed hat, and the grotesque, bird-like mask. The mask's beak wasn't for theatrical flair. It was packed with dried flowers, herbs, and spices like cloves and rosemary, intended to filter the poisonous miasma. One Venetian account advised filling it with strong perfumes, myrrh or camphor, to keep death itself at bay. It didn't work, of course, but it gave an illusion of control in a world unraveling. Amulets and charms were another form of protection. A patient might wear a sprig of rue or a small pouch of mercury tied around the neck. Some carried written charms, short prayers or fragments of scripture, believing they would shield the body from illness. In one particularly desperate ritual, people were instructed to hold a live hen against their skin to draw out the plague. A 15th century German text even advised drinking a potion made of ground emeralds, for those who could afford to turn jewels into medicine. Surgeons, meanwhile, performed their work barehanded, their tools wiped on their tunics between procedures. Guy de Chauliac, one of the era's leading medical minds, wrote detailed instructions for setting broken bones and lancing buboes, plague swellings, yet his guidance on cleanliness boiled down to keep your instruments fresh and sharp. He at least recognized that dirty bandages made wounds worse, a rare nod toward what we might call hygiene. And then there was urine, not just as waste, but as medicine. Physicians used it as a diagnostic tool, holding flasks of it up to the light to divine the state of a patient's humors. But they also prescribed it. A 14th century medical compendium recommends washing wounds with freshly passed urine, which was thought to be both cleansing and spiritually neutral. Some even drank it as a tonic. Herbal remedies walked the line between wisdom and superstition. Wormwood for stomach aches, lavender for melancholy, ground pearls for fevers. One English leech book coolly recommends a salve for infections made from honey, garlic, and the fat of a roasted mouse. The boundaries between medicine, magic, and kitchen craft were porous. These remedies weren't madness. They were born from the medical theories and religious beliefs of the time, a world where illness was as much a spiritual trial as a physical one, and where a charm from a saint might be as powerful as a surgeon's knife. And through it all, water, that most basic of cleansers, remained an afterthought. To bathe too much, to wash too deeply, was still seen as a dangerous opening of the body's defenses. Better to stay sealed, protected by your own grime, fortified by herbs, prayers, and the occasional live hen. Step outside Europe, and the medieval world smells, and feels, very different. In the Arab world, bathing wasn't a suspicious indulgence. It was an obligation. Rooted in Islamic law, ghusl, full-body washing, and wudu, ritual ablution, were essential parts of daily life. Mosques across cities like Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba were built with fountains for washing before prayer, and public hammams, bathhouses, were as common as churches in Europe. Travelers from Christian lands marveled at these places. The 12th century pilgrim Benjamin of Tudela described the bathhouses of the Levant as marvelous places of cleanliness and delight, where one could not only bathe but be massaged, scrubbed, and perfumed with scented oils. Fulcher of Chartres, a Crusader chronicler, wrote almost wistfully of the delightful baths of the East, where even the poorest could access comforts that in Europe were reserved for kings. These hammams weren't just about cleanliness. They were social centers, places to talk, rest, and do business. They were heated by sophisticated furnaces, tiled in bright mosaics, and staffed by attendants who made sure you left cleaner, and often more fragrant, than you arrived. And they weren't occasional luxuries. In cities like Damascus or Baghdad, people bathed weekly, sometimes even daily. Further north, the Byzantine Empire had preserved much of Rome's love of bathing. Constantinople boasted vast public baths where marble halls echoed with the sound of running water. Byzantine medical texts encouraged washing as part of a healthy regimen, especially in combination with oils and steam. The city's aqueducts and cisterns ensured a reliable water supply, making what seemed impossible in medieval London, a steady flow of clean water, an everyday reality in the Queen of Cities. Even in the forests and steppes of Chivan Rus, cleanliness had a place. Slavic chronicles mention the banya, a kind of steam bath not unlike today's sauna, where villagers would sweat out impurities before plunging into cold water. The practice blended hygiene with ritual. In some areas, it was tied to spiritual cleansing, especially before major life events like weddings. The 12th century chronicler Helmold of Bosor wrote with amazement about Slavic peasants who bathe themselves often in hot steam, then leap into rivers as though they do not fear death. To Europeans raised on warnings about baths. weakening the body, and inviting disease. These practices could seem decadent, even dangerous. Yet to those who lived in these cultures, washing was part of being human, an act of health, piety, and community. The contrast is stark. In London or Paris, a peasant might wash once a season and mask the smell with a sachet of herbs. In Damascus or Cordoba, a laborer could spend his evening in a tiled, heated bath, scrubbed clean and perfumed before heading home. In Constantinople, the poorest citizen could still enjoy a soak in a marble pool that would put a European lord's wooden tub to shame. And this wasn't just about luxury. These cultures had linked cleanliness to holiness, to medical wisdom, to the very rhythm of daily life. Where Europe wrapped itself in dirt and fear of open pores, its neighbors embraced the cleansing, healing, and yes, pleasurable power of water. What do these contrasts tell us? That medieval Europe wasn't merely dirty, out of laziness or ignorance, it was dirty with purpose. Where the Arab world linked water to ritual purity, Europe associated it with vulnerability. Where Byzantines embraced bathing as a medical and social good, Europeans saw it as a gateway to sin or sickness. The difference wasn't just in habit. It was in worldview. For medieval Europeans, filth had meaning. Dirt wasn't just the byproduct of a hard life. It was armor, against bad air, against the moral corruption they believed could seep in through indulgence, even against the judgment of God. A body unwashed was, in some cases, a body humbled. This is why certain monastic orders allowed only a handful of baths each year. Why physicians warned that hot water softens the body and makes it vulnerable to disease. Why the laity feared that too much cleanliness meant pride. Fear was the undercurrent. Fear of invisible miasmas creeping into open pores. Fear of tempting the flesh in the steamy intimacy of a bathhouse. Fear of angering God by embracing too much earthly pleasure. The medieval body was porous not just to disease, but to sin. And so keeping it sealed, swaddled in layers of clothing, crusted in its own dirt, became a form of defense. But these fears came at a cost. Compared to their contemporaries in Damascus, Constantinople, or Kiev, medieval Europeans lived in cities that reeked of human waste and disease, where bathing was rare and perfume did the work water could have done better. When Crusaders encountered the hammam, they were both enchanted and unsettled by a world where washing wasn't an occasional luxury, but a regular duty. Some brought back the habit. Most brought back only the sense. It's easy to scoff at this from the comfort of our chlorinated showers. But to live in the Middle Ages was to live in a constant negotiation between survival, sin, and status. Cleanliness was never just about being clean. It was about who you were, what you believed, and where you stood in a world that blurred the line between the physical and the spiritual at every turn. And so the story of medieval hygiene, or its absence, isn't simply one of filth. It's one of fear, faith, and the fragile ways people tried to make sense of a dangerous, unpredictable world. And so, as the last candles sputter in the smoky great hall and the streets outside fall quiet, imagine yourself in that world for just a moment. A world where water was both friend and foe, where perfume replaced soap, and where the smell of incense mingled with the stench of the city, a strange harmony of sacred and profane. The medieval world was never still. It was loud, crowded, and layered with contradictions. Dirt and perfume. Faith and fear. Splendor and squalor. Every smell told a story, of survival, of piety, of a people doing their best to keep body and soul intact in a fragile age. It's easy to judge them by our standards. But perhaps, if you look closely, you see something more human than the filth, the care hidden in a sprig of rosemary sewn into a sleeve, the courage in a gong farmer's midnight labor, the hope in a crusader who, for one brief moment, found delight in a bath far from home. And as we leave this world behind, let it settle quietly in your mind. The great, messy, fragrant, fearful, and beautiful truth of medieval Europe, that even in the darkest centuries, people sought ways to live with dignity, to soften their hardships with little rituals of comfort, even if it was only a handful of herbs pressed close to the heart. So breathe deeply, let the noise of the hall fade, and step back into the stillness of your own time, a little more grateful for the clean water waiting for you tomorrow. And now, I believe you're already drifting off, so just let the soft crackle of the fire carry you into the sweetest dreams.